Welcome to a very special series on the St. Luke's podcast that is all about deconstructing faith. We're your hosts, Jon Jones and Mindie Moore, and we've been through the process of deconstructing and building back faith, and we love to talk about it with you. This is a 6-part series where we can go deeper into some of the elements that make deconstruction difficult, but also so very worth it. Whether you're at the beginning of your deconstruction journey or you've been doing this work for decades, we're glad you're here.
Well, hello. I am back here with Mindie Moore. I am Jon Jones, and
Hi, Jon.
We are on part number 4 of the 6-part podcast series. So welcome back. Yeah. Good to be with you, Mindie.
It's good to be with you.
Oh, well, here's the fun part. Today, we have got the topic du jour. And by today and topic du jour, I actually just
Those
repeated
are the same thing.
Today twice. But we're going to be talking about family and deconstruction, because why not get a little messy today, right? We've talked about all different kinds of forms of trauma and kind of the history of experiences, but what happens when you're deconstructing and you still have to interact with family or friends or maybe even a spouse? So
my favorite was coming home during college, and not only was I questioning some things about my faith and
were you
all
deconstructing at that point, or was it just kind of questions?
Oh, I think I didn't have that word, but definitely questions.
Okay.
Definitely feeling like, I'm not sure the place I came from is like the place that I belong anymore.
So big structural questions.
Yes, big I love a good big structural question in my life, an existential crisis. Yes, it was beginning. But I remember going to, it was probably Christmas Eve, that would make sense. And not only were there all the questions, but there were also guys I had dated. I mean, it was whoa, this is a lot happening in this place.
That's the worst.
So basically, it got as awkward as it could have been.
Yeah,
is the bottom line.
Yeah, I grew up in in the conservative Baptist world, which is if you take Southern Baptist and go more conservative, that's kind of where it's at a little bit. And so when I would go back home from college, my mom and dad would be, hey, you gonna come to church with us this Sunday? And you walk in, you're like, ooh, yeah, it's fun to see all these people that I grew up with that never changed. And, when we're talking about this whole podcast about deconstruction at its most core level is really just change, right?
Yeah.
It's about, what pieces and components of yourself you're holding on to and what pieces you're letting go of and what pieces you're healing from. And when you see old friends who haven't changed, it's almost like kind of tossing the knife back in there all over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is when it just becomes really hard to know, how do we relate to each other?
Right.
Because how do you communicate? And I think people who have been through deconstruction can relate to this. How do you communicate? Hey, I've changed. My beliefs have changed. How I relate to God has changed. You haven't. I'm not passing judgment on you, but I do want you to hear where I am.
Yeah, for sure. And it can happen in other parts of your life, right? I mean, it's like when the college kid goes off to school, comes back, and it's like, well, mom and dad, where's the oat milk? And they're like, well, we got all 2% for you over here, kind of gig. So, yeah. I mean, it happens. Deconstruction happens in other parts of our lives, but it just doesn't hold as much weight maybe as it is when it comes to our spiritual lives and our faith lives, because those are the things that inform what we think an ideal life should look like. Am I right?
Yes. And that, oh man, I have so many stories. I'm not going to tell you all my stories.
I want to hear them all.
But I do think that's a great point about the expectations, because sometimes they are spoken.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are unspoken.
Oh, those are the worst ones.
Oh, they are. Because you walk
down
right into it. And then you're like, whoa, hold up. We were just talking about milk.
Right.
And now we're having a conflict. Because
100%.
what happened here?
Oh, you one of them liberals that drinks oat milk?
Right. No, it just hurts my stomach, Jon. Okay, that's all. But I think for me, when I was growing up in my family of origin, there was a lot of narrative spoken and unspoken about what a woman's role was.
Yeah, right.
And I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, someone who I love dearly in my family said to me, well, when that baby comes, you're not going to want to go back to work.
Ooh.
And I was like, but what if I do? And there was a lot to untangle there about like, you know, what are our values? What are our family norms? And the person who said this to me had spent her entire life, I mean, we're talking like 60 years being a homemaker and doing amazing work as that.
Sure.
But I wanted different things.
Sure.
And so having that like conversation and that, you know, understanding that just because I want something different doesn't mean what you did was wrong.
Yeah, right. And for a lot of us that grew up inside the church world, I think that's a pretty normative experience where mom and dad, or grandparents especially, grew up in a more kind of patriarchal type of male-led situation. And so it was kind of expected that, okay, you can go off and have your fun now in college or do your thing. But, you know, when you grow up and become an adult, when you get married, when you have kids, you'll settle down kind of gig. And the settling down was almost that expectation that you'll become traditional at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'll come back to what you've been taught.
Right. Almost, you know, they always joke about salmon, they go upriver to spawn, right? And it's like the salmon will come back home where they were born and do this whole thing. And I think a lot of time, in fact, I even heard it spoken in staff meetings at some of the early churches I worked at, that they weren't worried about trying to serve or minister to people in their 20s because, well, they're just doing their things and someday they'll come back when they've got kids. Yeah, right?
No,
right?
My face right now is making a very
I know.
face.
You want trauma, though. Like the idea that like, well, we can write off an entire generation until they come back and become like us again.
Wow.
Was pretty big.
And all the assumptions there. Assumptions about what someone's life will look like and what someone desires for their future to be.
And what should be normative and what should be regular. And so it was very difficult then both to serve inside of that. Because here's the weird part about me is that although I deconstructed pretty heavily and across the course of about 15 to 20 years, I stuck with the church the entire way. And I was working inside of churches and basically just taking those shots across the bow at all times. And even from people that I loved, like you said, in my own families, like my nuclear family was actually pretty good. But my larger extended family was, you know, a little tougher on that front of like, well, you know, you better marry that right person if you're going to be a pastor who, you know, can help play the organ and, you know, teach Sunday school and maybe teach a Bible class or something like that. And my wife would cringe if she was that way. So
yeah. Well, and I think about like my own family of origin, and you know, part of my story is that my family so my mom died when I was little. My dad was very dysfunctional. Like there's just a lot of like turbulence, I guess would be a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And all of that happened within the context of the church. And so like, I think even as I got older, you know, deconstructing beliefs, but also deconstructing experiences and thinking about, well, what do I want my family to look like? Hopefully not that turbulent. Hopefully, you know, built around some different values. And that can it can cause a lot of tension and a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, because at that point, you're discovering identity, right?
Yeah.
What do I want my identity to be? What do I want my family's identity to be? And I think what's difficult is that a lot of times when you're discovering that, it's actually a thrilling experience.
Yeah.
Right? The moments where you begin to be like, whoa, I actually think, you know, maybe this part of faith meant I'm supposed to take care of the poor and the oppressed, and maybe I should become active in justice issues, or like, you know, when Jesus talked about this, I think maybe we missed it. And you get kind of a little bit amped on it where you're like, hey, how do I get my family involved and engaged in this? And if they're looking at you going like, excuse me, what do you believe about Jesus and about Bible and about life and faith? That's when it gets really tough because your new and thrilling experiences are being not just looked down upon, but actually cast to the side.
And it can kind of just feel like running into a brick wall.
Oh, 100%.
Like you come in with all this enthusiasm and all this knowledge and experience, and it's like, wait, maybe there's not space for this. Or maybe somehow by trying to draw people in, I have like offended or you know, felt like someone was being attacked, and that wasn't the intent.
No, I don't think it is. But I think pushback inside of family systems is really, it is, I would argue, probably the most normal thing for somebody who's deconstructing, and it can feel the most isolating too. Because in a family system, if you don't have somebody that's kind of on your side, all of a sudden you're all out, just kind of floating in a boat in your family setting. And at worst, you can be like fully excommunicated from your family, right?
Right. I mean, and those are some of the saddest stories that we hear.
For sure. It happens quite a bit. And I just, you sit there wondering a little bit if it's not necessarily even just the church that's been so destructive and created a lot of trauma in people's lives, but if it's our own families that were genuinely, they thought they were trying to like follow God, but they were off base so far that it ended up destroying our own souls in such a way that we lost touch with our families.
Mm-hmm. And, sometimes I think when we're in these settings, like with our families, and we're trying to talk about, our new beliefs or even just, I won't, that's even like way down the road probably, but say we bring into the space, a question that we're holding, like, hey, our family's always kind of thought this. I'm wondering about, and this is like the most diplomatic, this is not how these conversations go, right? Like it's sort of like, wait, I think this. But I think that there's a lot of fear often in that. And not just fear for the person who is asking the question, but fear to the person receiving that. Like, well, if you pull on that thread and the whole thing falls apart, like you're going to go hell. That's where the wheels start turning and like, oh my gosh, are you going to lose your faith? Are you going to lose your connection to God?
Yeah. There's a genuine level of fear a lot of times, especially I would say maybe from grandparents or older members of our families that we're genuinely going to like go to hell somehow.
Yeah.
And it goes, we've talked a little bit about the idea of building a wall of kind of faith, but it's really just certainty. And I think for a lot of those people who haven't spent time critically analyzing kind of their belief structures and systems or putting it up against kind of the reality of their experience, that for some of them, it does feel like if I tug at that thread, and even if they felt it themselves and just shoved it down below the surface, which I would bet that's probably what's happened for a lot of people, it can feel like it's going to fall apart if we do this. And are you the one in our family who's going to unravel everything that I've built over the course of our lifetime?
Mm-hmm. I also think what's interesting about this, and this is not a universal experience. So like you can deconstruct at any point, right? Like
totally.
Some of my greatest gifts as a pastor have been sitting with people like who are in later in life and they're starting to ask questions they've never asked before. So you can deconstruct at 80, you can do it at 18, whatever. I do think a lot of people, it does coincide with like going to college or young adulthood. And I guess I just want to say like, if that's you, or maybe you have a child in that demographic and you're listening, it's a little tricky when this all happens together, because I think like it is normal in that phase of life for you to be grabbing onto your own identity, for you to be asking questions about, is everything I was taught, faith, whatever it
2%
looks
milk.
like. Yeah, right. Milk.
Yeah.
Any of it. Like, is that what I want to carry into my adulthood, my personhood? And it's normal. It kind of sucks. Like, it is a moment for families where people are learning and unlearning and creating. And like, I think even getting to know each other again.
Yeah. It's hard when it feels like you're on a journey and now the roads for your journey have begun to diverge a little bit.
Yeah.
And part of what we have to examine, I think, when we think about deconstruction in family or friends or loved ones or whatever, is the experience that we've had together as a family unit, and is the love that we have generated and had together worth letting go of in pursuit of this? Or is there a pathway to say, hey, maybe we can still love one another while simultaneously disagreeing on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do think it can be a challenging task to figure out how to honor that place you've come from, and also celebrate wherever God is taking you, if that looks very different.
Well, and I think inside of there too, the thing that we haven't talked about is boundaries a little bit, right?
Oh yeah, we love boundaries.
Because I definitely at one point had a loved one, tell me, well, I'm just going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that God changes, the way you think about this kind of thing. And you're
That's encouraging.
You're like, oh, well, I'm not sure that leveraging our relationship with God in order to pick our preferred political beliefs is the way that this was all intended, maybe. But I do think there's a sense where creating boundaries can be a really healthy thing with family members. And simultaneously, we have to be careful that we set boundaries that still allow us to love them and to be in relationship with them while not completely destroying and cutting off all. I mean, maybe there are times where that's super necessary. There are some family systems that are so toxic that for sure that's where the boundary has to be set. But I would argue for most situations, the nuclear option is not necessary. You got to go.
No. And I think that is maybe what makes it so tricky sometimes is that you're totally right. And I mean, I've experienced this like with some of my own parental relationships. Like you just got to cut it off and move on and
we're not going to talk about
give
this
it to God, right?
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of people, it's like, well, no, I really love my family. I love my parents or my caregiver. Like I love them. I want to spend time with them. It's just we get in these moments and it's sticky and somehow we kind of like step on each other. And I don't want to do that, but how do I not do that? That's the story I hear most often.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, I think part of what we have to think through then is like, in terms of being healthy, what do you want to create? Like realistically, what do you want to cultivate in terms of your family experience now that you are in the place of deciding, now that you're not just being towed along for the ride? What do you want to create when it comes to those relationships with your parents, with your grandparents, or heck, with like friends even? Like, have you had friends that you've had these tough experiences with? You ever had those deconstruction moments with friends where they look at you like you're absolutely off the rails?
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. I'm thinking about a gathering I was at not too long ago in the pretty recent past where I would say several of us there have absolutely deconstructed our faith and, you know, really changed from where we were when we shared a season of life together. But there were a couple folks who hadn't. And watching those interact, like they were friendly, you know, it was fine. There was no drama. But there was a missing of each other, if you get what I'm trying to say. Like there were places where it felt hard to connect and like conversations that would start and they'd be like, ooh, this is probably not the moment for this. Like we haven't seen each other in a while.
Yeah.
And so I do think like that's interesting because I'm like, so I don't know if you know this about me, John. This is a big deal what I'm about to tell you
I'm
in
ready.
the world. So when I did the spiritual gifts inventory at St. Luke's, my number one spiritual gift was evangelism.
I never would guess that.
I know. It kind of freaked me out. I'm going to be honest. But then I was talking to a friend about it, and she's like, no, you literally never shut up about stuff when you're excited.
Yeah.
Like, you talk about it all the time. I was like, oh, that's true. So that would be true for me, like, with my faith journey.
Yeah.
Right? Like, when I learn things, I just want to tell you.
You want to tell other people, and you want them to feel it.
Yeah.
I'm an Enneagram 7, so I understand everything about this because when I get hyped on something, I want every other person to be hyped on.
Right. Like let's be hyped together. Let's do it. And so I think when I was in that situation, like with that group of friends, it felt like a bummer because I was like, I like really want you to know what I know, what I'm about, and what my life looks like.
I've been growing.
And I like totally get that you can't celebrate some of the things that I'm celebrating. And I want to honor you and show you love. Yeah. But that means like we probably can't go to a certain place together.
Yeah. I remember a very specific conversation I had. So I had a friend who was involved in, I'm going to be very generic here, involved in a politics type of adjacent field where they spent a lot of time with politicians and getting politicians to vote in certain directions and stuff like that, and pretty high powered. And I was having dinner over at their house with a bunch of other friends, and we got onto a very specific political topic that a lot of Christians choose to vote on. And I'm being so dancing around, but that's okay. And I remember stating my opinion on it and kind of how I felt about it. And I just remember the dead-eyed stare across from me and being like, oh boy, I
am alone in this opinion, in this space.
I might have just stepped off of the boat here. And I remember the other people sitting around the table beginning to question immediately and saying, well, what about this? What about this? Have you thought about this? Don't you realize? And, I answered every question in what I felt was a very suitable manner. But But it wasn't the answers to the questions that I worried about. And at that point, it wasn't even being right that I was worried about. It was the fact that I could tell in that moment that a serious fracture had just happened with people that I loved dearly.
Right. And it's like, can these relationships
withstand this?
Yeah. Can it withstand the change that's happening?
Yeah. Yeah. Can it withstand the change? And is there a level of belief that is necessary then to break my relationship with this person? And I thought no. And it felt like the answer might be yes on the opposite end of the table. And that hurt.
Yeah.
On a deep, deep level. Like, how do you look at somebody and be like, hey, I'm not trying to argue with you at all. We were on the topic and I was stating my opinion, and sorry, you guys all thought my opinion was your way and maybe it's not. And it's in those moments you feel a little lost sometimes, I think.
Well, and I think you're hitting on another angle of fear that I hadn't thought about until you were telling this story. If we like couch it in the topic of our families, okay, maybe there's a fear for, oh, you don't believe the right thing anymore. Like, are you okay? Mm-hmm. But I wonder if there's a fear too of, can we withstand this difference? Will you reject me? Will I reject you? Like, how are we going to find this common ground that we've had?
Yeah.
But now maybe it's not there. And so what does that mean?
Well, and even I think there's a fear of, are you going to infect this system of friendship, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we all just kind of agree on everything and have a happy-go-lucky fun time. But if you have a different opinion, maybe you inject just the right amount of like problematic thought into this that all of a sudden it breaks apart.
Jon, I have like been the problematic thought in so many social settings in my life.
Give me a good one. I want to hear this.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think about like we had a group of neighbors once, and like I just feel like I was always the downer. Like always.
How could you be the downer?
Because I just had so many thoughts and opinions that were not often shared by the group. And like that's fine. Like I'm comfortable with that. I respect where people are coming from. But I did notice like it's not always a natural sort of like volley back and forth of, oh, you believe this, cool, I don't. Let's have a conversation.
Yeah, let's play a little bit of thought tennis here.
Sometimes it's just like, well, now it's an awkward silence.
Oof, those are the worst ones.
I know, and I don't love an awkward silence. But I think I've been the creator of many.
Yeah, it's a little bit like when you're married, right? When you and I are both married, if you're listening and you're not, maybe this doesn't hit right, but when you're married and you say something where you realize like, oh, my spouse and I disagree on this.
Yeah.
And that awkward silence is like, how do you cover over it? Is it like, oh, well, the weather sure is nice today, and just change topics?
Like, can we talk about this?
Right. Is this something that actually foundationally cracks where we're at?
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you brought up spouses. So we are going to talk about marriage for like 20 seconds. Okay.
All
maybe
right.
a minute and a half.
Let's do it.
So if this is not your jam, you can just go for it. But I do think it's important to talk about deconstruction we can even just say like romantic partnerships.
Yeah.
Because, oftentimes we think about this as like, oh, I was in with my parents and my siblings, and then I changed, and now like Thanksgiving's weird.
Some old friends.
Yeah. But actually, because we know that like our faith isn't static, it evolves throughout our lives. If we are partnered, there's just a possibility, just a slim chance that our faith may not evolve at the exact pace of the person we're partnered with.
It sounds like you have experience in this, Mindy.
So, okay, well, a little bit about my story is that Zach, my husband, and I, we met when we were 16, 17.
High school sweethearts.
High school sweethearts.
Oh, sweet.
So we're now, whenever this releases, his birthday's in like 4 days. We are both 37, I'm going to say. He likes to give me a lot of grief because I'm 5 months older than him. This is a whole deal.
I get it.
But we're going to say we're both 37.
So you're cheating the system right now.
Yes,
okay.
I am.
I got you.
And I'm really happy about it.
Sorry, Zach.
Sorry, Zach, are you listening? I don't know. But so we've known each other, for 20 years.
Wow.
That's wild.
It's a long time.
20 years.
Yeah.
And you may be able to guess, we have changed just a wee bit
in
the 22 decades that we've been together.
Yeah.
And so like, I remember once we were having a conversation about like a huge faith topic, which I'm not even going to scratch the surface because this will become an hour-long episode. You will all get distracted. But we're having a conversation about a faith topic. And it quickly became apparent that we had wildly different opinions on it. And we're we are actually a super low conflict marriage.
That's good.
It's great. It works really well for us. Sure. But it was weird to sit there and be like, oh, we believe really different things about this. And it's a kind of like a fundamental thing that we're talking about. And so what does that mean? Is it cool that we believe different things? Like, can we ask questions? And we ended up having a good conversation, but it was one of the few moments that I can pinpoint when we were talking about faith that we were like, oh, we're not actually on the same page.
Right. And I think what you're getting at a little bit is this idea of like, do I have to be perfectly aligned with somebody else, regardless of whether it's a romantic partnership or a friendship or family? Do I have to be perfectly aligned with somebody else in order to be in relationship with them? One, but I think two, maybe even more important, to have a healthy and functioning relationship with them. And I think that's what the fear, I think, having gone through it, that deconstruction brought to me the most was, if I have a differing level of thought and opinion, do I get cast out, or do I have to cast them out, or can we move forward with it?
Like, can we hold space for the difference?
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Is it possible for you, even I would argue, hey, if you're a parent listening who has children that are deconstructing, or a grandparent who watches your grandchildren doing it, at the event, we talked a little bit about the idea of kind of loving them through it, regardless of kind of where they sit and stuff like that. But I do think there's also moments of holding space, even if you disagree with somebody, that I think what Jesus showed us was that the ultimate pathway wasn't having to have perfect agreement necessarily, but that we could love somebody in spite of it and hold space for people in spite of it. That what you watch Jesus do is slowly but surely help people to change and shift their opinions. But he also kind of let people have differing opinions sometimes, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think we as people can be very, like conflict avoidant, or feel like, disagreement is the beginning of the end of relationships. Yeah. But when we talk about Jesus and look at that example, I don't really think that's how he lived at all. I mean, he was... he was a little bold. Just
a little bit.
A little. But you think about, the good conversations that he had. You think about the way that his disciples...
He's gentle.
And like the disciples would have conflict all the time, but at the end of the day, they'd sit around the table.
Yeah, every single time. Well, and that points toward, is your deconstruction, do you see it as a righteous cause that you are kind of on a crusade to, get everybody to agree with you? And do you become so dogmatic in the opposite direction that you become just as much of a jerk as what you were trying to deconstruct from?
Yeah.
And so is there a pathway in the center of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that kind of brings us to the last thing we want to talk about today, which is, how are you in relationship? What do we do to be in relationship with people who either haven't deconstructed, or, maybe they have and they've still ended up in a very different place than us? Like, how do we create those relationships? Now, again, we'll put the disclaimer, like, some relationships end because they are not healthy.
Yeah, they're toxic.
And that is hard, and it grieves us. Yeah. And it's also can be really healthy. So we're really talking about, like, okay, you love these people. Yeah. It's healthy. You just have some big differences.
Yeah. And I think in those moments, it's okay just to let things sit where they're at sometimes, and just realize that I can love you on a human level, and we can connect as human beings without having to have the layers of opinion and layers of, like, this is what I believe versus what you believe. It's not a versus, that we're in this together.
Yeah. Oh, I love how you phrase that. It's not a versus, we're in this together. Because it can feel like when you're walking into those spaces, like, oh, I've got to be ready to defend my perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe we can lay some of that armor down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think not even just laying the armor down, but we can become the people who create peace. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, right? And I think there's that sense where when you are a peacemaker, that you will take shots. You will take some blows along the way, but that doesn't mean those will kill you. That means that you'll be able to withstand them, because the pathway of peace is much stronger than the pathway of conflict.
Yeah. I think too, I'm thinking about this now, going back to like family of origin relationships. But I think when we deconstruct and when we go into these relationships, there's often questions, just a few. And I think for folks who are deconstructing or who have just like kind of moved through that and created something new, it can feel like those questions are very hostile.
Yeah. It can feel like an attack on what you're discovering.
And I'm not sure, I say this gently, friends, I'm preaching myself, but I'm not sure that's always fair.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times, like our loved ones who haven't deconstructed, they just kind of want to know why. Yeah. And tell me like how you got here, because it is so different than what I believe. It is so different than even my lived experience.
They genuinely don't understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I would just like caution us as we're in these relationships to not think that like everything is a debate
An
team.
Attack.
Yeah. Like you don't have to be ready to like defend. They just maybe want to know. And, that could be a charitable way to read that.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you are able to set that kind of sense of pride aside a little bit and be able to be like, you know what, this is just kind of how I got here. This is kind of the place that I've arrived at. Sometimes that's disarming in and of itself. And other times, honestly, just being willing to be graceful and merciful and realize that they're on a journey too. And that their journey might not be where yours is at, but life will take them on some pretty rugged paths as well that maybe that'll help carry it through.
Yeah. And that there's probably things about their story that you don't understand.
100%.
Oh, look, I love to be right. So it's hard. but I think it's good to, if we talk about, building relationships and creating empathy, it's a joint venture here. We both all have to do that.
Yeah, exactly. It does. It takes a little bit of compromise back and forth, and you're not being loved based on being right.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we think about family relationships, this week we've looked at sort of the families we come from or the families we create. And next time we're going to go a little deeper in that, and we're going to look at how we deconstruct and parent.
Oh boy.
I know, which we're also both parents. So this will be great. And, I would just say that as we're listening to this, as we're having these conversations, all family structures are different. We all bring different things to this place. But I think it's great when we can sort of lay our experiences out and see like, okay, well, what's working and where do we find that common ground and that common way to love each other?
For sure.
Yeah. So we will see you next time as we look at parenting and deconstruction. But we're glad that you're with us today.